in the East will be joining us today, and he'll be talking you through the output from the Martin Rowlands Primary Care Commission report, which you will have seen from some media coverage was received by the board yesterday. So I think that's a really important piece of work and something that I think will very much help influence the direction of travel for us around developing the future primary and community care workforce. So Simon will be joining you in a few minutes to do a special guest starring appearance on the webinar. We also had some feedback from people that the question and answer sessions didn't quite work as planned, and I think this is something we need to keep playing around with in terms of until we get it right. But what we've done for today is to go for asking people to submit questions in advance. So I've got quite a large pack of questions here that have been submitted from almost all LETBs around the country that I'll try and work my way through a little bit later on after we've heard from Simon. I can tell you now, I'm not going to get through all of them. There just won't be enough time. But as previously, any questions that have been asked, we will make sure they're answered, and the answers will be put on the website for everybody to refer to. So what I wanted to do is to start by just saying a little bit about the ministerial team that we're working with now, and a little bit about some of the ministerial priorities, and perhaps just trying to build on some of the announcements that Secretary of State has made in his two major keynote speeches that we've had since the Conservative government came into power. I think the first comment I would make is that we now have a tremendous amount of interest in workforce and in HEE across Whitehall. So we no longer just have perhaps one minister taking a lead on matters workforce, with Jeremy inviting us to his weekly meetings as and when appropriate. We now have almost every member of the ministerial team with some aspect of workforce in their brief. And this is great in terms of opportunities for us to influence agendas, to shape agendas, to make sure that we're delivering what we need to deliver as quickly as possible with that ministerial backing and support. But it also makes it a real challenge in terms of both briefings for myself and other people that are appearing in regular meetings with the ministers, and the volume of work and the timescales to turn around that we're actually asking for within the organisation. So I want to start with an enormous thank you. I'm not going to try and name people because I'm bound to miss people out, but I know over the last 4 or 6 weeks we have been making unreasonable demands on a number of people in terms of getting briefings to me or getting briefings to ministers on particular issues. I know people have had to work weekends to do that. I know people have worked late at night. I know people have worked very early in the morning to get those briefings turned around. So a huge, enormous, heartfelt thank you for that. It's not a way that I want HEE to work on an ongoing basis. I don't mind asking for favours from people every now and then, but we have to make sure that we've got something sustainable and that we're not eating into people's home time. On the positive side, what I can say is that those briefings have made a difference, and the level of influence, the level of engagement, the level of involvement that we've been able to have has been fantastic. So if I start with Jeremy's speech on primary care, then probably 50% of that speech was heavily influenced by things that HEE either wanted to do or things that HEE are being asked to deliver. So they range from the increase of 5,000 doctors working in general practice between 2015 and 2020. And just to break that number down a little bit for you, the expectation is that 1,000 of that 5,000 net increase will come from improved retention, i.e. persuading people to retire a little bit later, or persuading people who are otherwise thinking of leaving the profession or the specialty to actually stay there a bit longer, and indeed return to practice. There are a large number of GPs who fully trained, fully qualified as GPs, but perhaps aren't practicing, to see how many of those people can be encouraged to return to practice in a very rewarding specialty. So that's 1,000 of the 4,000. The rest of the 4,000 is basically down to us and the hard work that we need to do to attract more doctors into training in general practice. And I've just come back this morning from a visit with Sir Keith Pearson and Kate Neelan, one of our non-executive directors, to South London LETB. And we were at Nav Channa's practice at Cricket Ground in Mitcham. And I have to say, I was absolutely blown away by what we saw. both in terms of the enthusiasm of people working in primary care, but also the way in which they're really working hard at blurring the boundaries between different professionals working in that practice and indeed out in the wider community, but also the way that practices are coming together to try and address some of the training challenges, to try and look at what the most appropriate skill mix is that they need for the future. And I think it was just to myself and Keith and Kate, it was an absolutely fantastic example of primary and community care workforce at its very, very best. And I want to make sure that we do everything we can to publicise what they're doing, and indeed what I'm sure is happening in the rest of the country in primary and community care workforce development over the next few weeks, because it is a bit disheartening at times to just hear the negative about what the challenges are, what the issues are, what the problems are. We know they exist and we know we need to address them, but you know what? This morning was just a really good example of how, if people get together to try and solve some of the issues and challenges, we end up with a very different environment, a very different culture, and certainly an environment in which people want to work going forward. So the primary care aspect of Jeremy's speech, as I mentioned, there's the 5,000 doctors working in general practice. In addition to that, we're committed to training 1,000 physicians associates to work in general practice by 2020, and to producing a net increase of 4,000 AHPs and nurses and other healthcare professionals working in the primary care environment. Now, obviously, our job is to train these people, but it doesn't just stop there, because there's no point in us training people if they haven't got jobs to go into. So we're going to be working closely with NHS England and other colleagues to make sure that as we start training people for these new roles, that the jobs are also available for them to go into, so we can really start to transform how primary care is delivered, and we can really start to make real forward momentum on some of the pledges and some of the promises that have been made around further investment in primary care to keep pace not just with the growing population, but also to recognise that over the last few years, much of the expansion in the workforce has actually been in secondary care, yet we're trying to create a national health service that's delivered in the community within reach into hospitals. So how do we actually start to really come clean on our desires around those promises? So that was something about Jeremy's first speech. There was then another speech, more recent speech, in which he talked about intelligent transparency. He talked about the NHS being the leading system in the world for patients having confidence in understanding about clinical outcomes and the quality of care that they were going to receive. He also talked in some detail about 7-day working, and I think you probably can't help but have noticed that from media coverage and Twitter coverage. And for us, one of the key issues in that speech that he referred to was the development of leadership skills in the NHS workforce, and particularly the decision that has now been made to transfer responsibility for the Leadership Academy from NHS England to Health Education England. Now, there's a lot more work to be done on this. The decision is very new. I have said that I will chair a meeting that brings together the 6 main arm's length bodies in health to actually have a conversation with them about what they want from the Leadership Academy going forward, how we build on some of the fantastic work that the Leadership Academy has been doing to date, but also how we take on board some of the new challenges. So, for example, we know from the Rose report that there is a real desire to significantly increase the number of graduate trainees on the graduate training leadership management programs that the Leadership Academy offers. So how do we actually do that in an affordable, in a sustainable way that actually starts to address some of the other issues that people have identified in terms of what we may want from our leaders moving forward, so that people who've had experience of primary care, had experience of the acute sector, had experience of mental health, had experience of social care, local authorities, had experience of the arm's length bodies, how do we build all that in together? So much more to follow on the Leadership Academy. I know I've got 2 or 3 questions coming up in the pack about specifically what does it mean. The honest answer is it is too soon to tell. We're starting to set up some groups to actually look at this. My view would be that by the end of the autumn, I want to be in a position to have produced a narrative that actually says, okay, this is what we want to achieve out of the transition of the Leadership Academy into HEE. This is how we start to integrate the Leadership Academy in our work to make sure that we don't have a disconnect, for example, between work that we're doing at undergraduate level or work that we're doing with postgraduate medical trainees and the work of the Leadership Academy. How do we actually bring that all together and connect it? So we'll keep you updated on that. Another couple of quick issues that I wanted to touch on. I've already mentioned my visit this morning with Sir Keith and Kate out to South London, which was fantastic, just to plug that once more. But actually, we've been on a number of visits over the last few weeks, so huge thank you to those people out in the local teams who've made the visits possible for us. I'm not going to be able to talk about every visit because of time, but perhaps just to mention three of the more recent ones. We had a great visit out to the East Midlands, where it was a privilege to meet some young doctors who are participants on the pilot pre-GP year, one of the initiatives that Shona and the team in East Midlands have been taking forward, looking at whether or not we can give people a year's experience before they apply to go on to the GP training scheme, to make sure it's for them and to also to give them necessary experience and exposure so that they do well in the selection process. So it was a real privilege to meet a number of people on that scheme and to hear firsthand from them how successful they thought the scheme would be, and from memory to also hear that 82% of doctors on that scheme have now entered the GP training scheme this year, which I think for a pilot scheme is absolutely fantastic. And I think if we ever wanted any justification for rolling this out across the country, then that was absolutely it. West Midlands, we had a particularly interesting presentation from the School of Psychiatry, looking at how they take the curriculum that they have for specialty training and core training in psychiatry and fully integrate within that leadership skills and training. So I think this is particularly relevant to the work I mentioned earlier on in terms of how we take forward the Leadership Academy and how we look at properly integrating it. Now, to me, that work that was going on in the West Midlands is a classic example of do once and share. It may be that there's similar fantastic work going on elsewhere in the country, but if not, can I please suggest that we pick up the work that the West Midlands have done and have adopted, because it's great. There's been quite a lot of time and resource and money invested in it, and if we've got something that works, let's not go reinventing the wheel. And the final visit, which unfortunately I wasn't able to be present on because I was summoned to Whitehall because of some work being done on the Secretary of State's speech on primary care. But the third visit I wanted to mention was that to Thames Valley. And I think the feedback I've had from the Thames Valley visit was how impressed Keith and others that were on that visit, Steve Clark, who was there on my behalf, were with the work that was being done on taking forward some of the themes that came out of the staff survey locally, and particularly one of the issues in the staff survey that concerned me somewhat, which is the increase in the number of people in our teams reporting some form of bullying or harassment in the workplace. Now, this is not something that we want to tolerate in this organisation, and we need to understand more about what the causes are, more about what we can do to try and address these. Is it a result of staff working under pressure? Is it as a result of unhealthy cultures? Is it in part to do with the significant transformation that we've been through as an organisation over the last year or so with Beyond Transition and the required slimming down in our management structures? But it is one of the parts of the staff survey that I want us to particularly focus on. And I think there's a lot we can learn from what they're doing locally with Thames Valley. So on the staff survey, we've had a number of conversations now around the country, and all the local teams and different parts of the national teams have had their own tailored local results. And what's really refreshing is to see how different parts of the country are taking things forward. So Health Education West Midlands, for example, are doing senior management team walkabouts on a more regular basis now, because I think one of the comments that came back there was that not all the senior managers were always as visible as staff would like. So that's in place. In East of England, there's some work being done on having difficult conversations training. And again, I think that's a indirect response to how some people perceive that difficult conversations could be handled better. So let's look at what we can do to upgrade the level of training that we're providing. Healthy Workplace Charter in London and the South East, across all the local teams in London and the South East, I know there's been a lot of work done encouraging staff to sign up to that healthy workplace charter and really to try and make a difference. And in the North, I understand that there's training underway for managers within HEE to look at improving some behavioural skills within the work environment. And again, that links back to some of the concerns that came out in the staff survey around bullying. So I think please be reassured that we are picking up on the content of the staff survey. But can I also throw a challenge back to you that the staff survey is your views, your thoughts, your reflections, and this isn't just going to be solved by managers or directors trying to come along with solutions. Every single employee of this organisation has a part to play in making this the best possible environment to work in that we can do. So please be engaged, please be active, please don't be cynical. If you think something isn't going to work, then by all means say that, but you're only allowed to say it if you're going to come up with an alternative solution instead. So please be engaged, because we all want this to be a great place to work. It is a great place to work most of the time, but the staff survey is saying to me that we could do a little bit better. Just before I hand over to Simon, there's just one area that I did want to spend a few moments on, and that's the OD plan for HEE, and specifically, what are we going to do with regard to education, training and development opportunities for you, for our own team. As the organisation is responsible for educating, training and developing the current and future workforce, I actually think that we need to be an exemplar in terms of offering education and training opportunities to our own staff. And I don't think we are there yet. I think we've got a lot more to do. And what I'd like to do is to just divert a percentage of the time in each of our local teams and nationally that we spend on providing education and training opportunities for staff working out, delivering clinical services, to divert a little bit of that time into thinking about what do we actually need to provide for our own teams within HEE. So as we move through this year's appraisal season, I suppose, into next year's appraisal season, I'm going to be pushing quite hard on PDPs to actually look at what's coming out of personal development plans and to see what we can do as an organisation to collectively try and address some issues that are coming out there. But also I want to have a concerted push on the ABCDE Day concept. Again, as we go around the country, we're hearing about some parts of HEE that have completely and totally engaged with the concept, and some members of staff who are finding it really rewarding. In particularly interesting, the Do Your Bit Day, the Get Out Volunteering, Give Some Time for Charity Day. We've had some really positive examples and positive feedback about that. But there are some other parts of the country where perhaps the ABCDE Day concept isn't being pushed quite as hard. So I will be asking my direct reports through setting of objectives and conversations about performance to make sure that all staff are getting the opportunity to access those 5 ABCDE days. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to hand you back to your local areas for a few minutes. This is basically so that Simon Gregory can finish getting his makeup on and get properly mic'd up and take over from me standing here in front of the camera. So if you just give us 5 minutes, it gives you an opportunity to have a bit of reflection on anything I've said. If there are any thoughts or comments or views you want to feedback, you can actually use the software, the technology to do that, and I will be reading it. I was going to say while Simon's talking. Of course, I will be listening intently to every word that Simon says, but it will be coming up at a screen alongside me. So if you haven't got any thoughts or reflections, don't hesitate to feed those back. I'm going to hand over to Simon now, and then I'll come back in 10 minutes or so, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the questions and answers that you've got. Thanks for listening so far.
Good afternoon all. I hope you had a nice period of reflection. There's only one thing worse than doing my first ever webinar, but that's following the boss and having him still sitting in the room with scorecards. Ian's already talked about the importance of primary care, and I'm sure you all know that already. Yesterday at the board, it was my privilege to launch the Primary Care Workforce Commission report. We commissioned that from Martin Rowland, who's Professor of Healthcare Science at the University of Cambridge. He put together a commission of renowned academics from across the professions. They took evidence from many organisations and individuals, both in writing and in oral evidence sessions, with particularly good evidence from National Voices and the Patient Fora. GPs are key to our mandate. You all know that they are a deliverable that is non-negotiable for us as HEE, and it's really important that we do hit our GP recruitment numbers year on year. But actually it's about more than that. It's about having a sufficient, sustainable primary care workforce. And as Ian said, this has got the backing of the Secretary of State and Ministers, but it was very clear at our board meeting yesterday that the full HEE board really see this as our priority. And we're working together with NHS England, the Royal College of General Practitioners and the BMA to make sure this happens. But there really is no choice. We must deliver it. So we're doing work across a multitude of professions. We've got huge numbers of developments, and I know that you're all doing this in the HE offices up and down the land. I've had the opportunity to see work about GPs, GP nurses, advanced clinical practitioners of many guises, and of course allied health professionals, pharmacists, paramedics, physios, OTs, etc. And we can build on that work, and it's very clear that this report builds on that work as well. There are three key elements to this report. The first is, how does our current workforce need to work differently? The second are evidence-based proposals for a supportive workforce to ensure that GPs are doing that which only GPs can, but not needing to do all of the other things with it. And then fundamentally, for the future workforce. For me, general practice is the bedrock of the NHS, and this is about ensuring that general practice gives excellent care, but also that it's a great place to work. The report has many recommendations across 8 themes, but really I want to highlight 2 to you today. And on my next slide, you'll see the elements where the Rowland Commission talk about the multidisciplinary team. Huge amount of things that we're already doing across this team, these teams, and across the workforce. And this is vital for me, because often we talk about general practice as though it's just about GPs. Now, of course, as a GP, I might like to think that, but no, that's not the case. It's about the team around the patient, around the public. And then in my next slide, you'll see the recommendations around education and training. And it would be really strange in a webinar to Health Education England not to be mentioning the recommendations to ourselves. And I think there's a number of recommendations in this that are really key, and I hope that you will embrace them. And then we move to what you'll be pleased to know is my final slide, where we consider what is HE already doing. And again, Ian's covered much of this, but I hope on looking at this slide, you will recognise things that you're doing in your teams already. And I think it's absolutely vital that we build on this. It's building on the expertise. And again, as Ian said, it's about adoption and spread. It's making sure that we learn from each other. So really what I'd like to do is thank you for what you're doing to help patients through helping primary care, remembering our purpose of improving quality of care. So thank you for what each LETB is doing and the teams in the LETB. Also, thank you to our teams, both Joe Marvel's team in supporting the Commission, but also Vicky and the comms team that have done so much to get this report out there. The way it's landed in the press is yet again another good news story for Health Education England. Now, I've wanted to be a GP since I was 11. And I'm very proud to be a GP. I believe that GP is the best job in the world. I think we've just got to get that message across much more. If you have a chance to look at the report, on page 12 of it, you'll see a vision for general practice. That's really exciting. It really says what the best could be. I see general practice as the bedrock of the NHS, and I think it can be the bedrock of solutions for future patient care. I hope you will have time to read the report. Please do. Please consider it. Please also make sure that you engage with the people within your local areas to make sure that you get their feedback, because we really need to know what you and they think, because the board is looking at this again in October when the board will decide what else comes from it. But most of all, we must deliver. We must achieve our GP and general practice targets. So really my challenge to you now is, what do we do next? But thank you very much.
Hi everybody, you've got me back again. So thanks very much indeed to Simon for that debut presentation. I suspect we'll be having him back again. Thank you very much indeed. You've heard me say this before, but it is actually very odd being in a room just talking to the tiniest of tiny little cameras on the table in front of you, and not actually having any contact with the thousands of people who are actually out there listening. So it is a very, very surreal setting, and one that takes a little bit getting used to. Interestingly, just while Simon was talking, I sent Helen in my team a quick text just checking the technology was working. She's in Birmingham, to make sure that it was being received all right. And the response went along the lines of, yes, fine, particularly liked you doing your hair. So I have pointed out to her that actually I wasn't doing my hair, I was just hiding the bald patch at the front, but there we are. Right, moving on to the questions that we've received from people around the country. The first one is about the work of the WAB, the Workforce Advisory Board. So the HEE part of the architecture associated with the 5-year forward view. I think it's fair to say that the WAB has started a little bit later than some of the other pieces of work, particularly the vanguards, and that's been in part around making sure that we've got everything in place and aligned in the areas of work that we want to take forward. And because we also decided to undertake some discussion and debate across the wider system in terms of what the areas for real focus for ourselves would be. We've now determined that the 7 main areas of work on the exemplar strand are actually going to be around what can we do to identify best practice that's already out there that involves a change or a retraining in the workforce that we can spread at pace across the country as a whole. And the 6 areas that we're going to work on have now been chosen. The first of those is something around enhanced recovery. So this is about reducing the length of stay for people post-operatively in our hospitals, therefore freeing up bed days, therefore taking some of the pressure off hospitals and also improving the efficiency. There are some really good examples of this out there already, both in bowel surgery and in orthopedics. Those are the 2 main areas I'm aware of. But we still don't have this learning adopted widespread across the country as a whole. So what can we do about enhanced recovery? How can we speed up the dissemination of that across the country is going to be the first area. The second area is going to be what can we identify in primary and community care that's great practice that we can spread and that requires, again, an investment in education and training to deliver a change. The third area is mental health and LD. What is there in mental health and LD we could spread? Children's and young people is the 4th area, and the last area, which is the one that we have most recently decided on, we've concluded should be 7-day working. And I think particularly because of the focus from Secretary of State and Prime Minister on 7-day working, but also the fact that we in Health Education England strongly support the argument from Bruce Keogh and others that it is unacceptable for people who are admitted at weekends to not have the same standard of care as those people who are admitted on a Tuesday, Wednesday or Thursday, for example. So what do we need to do to further roll out 7-day working and make sure that that is a success across our NHS? So those are the areas, the 5 areas that we're going to be focusing on, and we'll keep you informed of the work of the WAB, and probably actually devote a little bit more time to the WAB and 5-year forward view generally at our next session. So I'm going to run through some of these questions. I'm going to duck and dive a little bit to make sure I try and get at least one question in from each area. So the first question is, what's happened to the stress survey? When are we going to see the results of the stress survey? Well, Gary has just informed me that the results are now in, literally today. We're going to be discussing them with trade union colleagues tomorrow, and then we're going to be sharing those around the organisation in August to see what we can actually do to help manage some of the workplace-based stress that people are reporting, and to see what we can put in place to try and alleviate some of that. So that's actively underway. A specific question came up about the Leadership Academy and whether or not we would be immediately blurring budget lines between HEE spend on leadership and the Leadership Academy. I think all I can say on this question is really to go back to what I said earlier, that we don't know yet, that we haven't taken the Leadership Academy into the organisation as of yet. I am mindful that many of our local teams spend quite a lot of money on leadership development in addition to the spend of the Leadership Academy, and what I really want to do is to look at how we spend the totality of the resource on leadership in the most effective way in which we possibly can. So what that actually means, too early to say. There certainly won't be any changes this financial year, but as we look at setting budgets for next financial year, then obviously we'll be taking those points into account. Moving to the north, and just to prove, because I have had a couple of comments that I only ever read out the questions I want to answer. Well, that's not actually true, but here we go. We see the expansion of HEE central teams in London, yet LETBs are continuing to embark on reducing costs. Is this a sign that we're embarking on another transition? No, it isn't at all. And again, I mean, it may be the perception, but it's not the reality. The budgets that we set as part of Beyond Transition are the budgets that we're all working to. There's been no additional investment in the central teams. But to be honest, we need to get away from this. We are one team. We are one Health Education England. We all work for the same organisation, and what we need is the right people in the right place to deliver the jobs that need delivering. It isn't an us and them, central teams versus local teams, or indeed, you know, the geographic people in there. We're about having the skills that we need to actually be able to provide the highest quality education, training and development to our current and future workforce, and we are a single team. So no, we aren't expanding the national teams at the expense of the local teams by any means. We're trying to make sure that we deliver what we need to, and the budgets haven't changed from those that we set as part of the Beyond Transition work. How can HEE support organisations with the workforce race equality standard? I think this is a really interesting area, and some of you may know that Keith Pearson has just been asked to chair the board for the Workforce Race Equality Standard, and obviously that gives HEE a particular link into the activity and work in that area. And I know that Lee Whitehead met with Roger Klein this week to also have a conversation about the work that the RES are doing. We've published our benchmark data. I think we're one of, if not the first ALB to actually do that. And that effectively is a baseline set of data to look at what are we doing moving forward with this really critically important agenda. I think it's also important to remember that in HEE, yes, we have a responsibility for our own team, for our own workforce, but we also have a absolutely critical responsibility for the entire workforce of the NHS. Because if we don't ensure that we are properly applying policies around equality and diversity, and properly working on getting the entry to universities for speech therapy, physiotherapy, pharmacy, medicine, nursing, whatever it may be, if we don't have a diverse entry into those professions, then the NHS is never going to change its diversity, because the NHS only recruits from people that we train. So we've got our own workforce responsibility, but we've got a much wider and much more critical responsibility for ensuring fairness, equity across every single professional workforce. And in some cases, this means that we need to look very differently at some areas. So we are seeing a significant reduction, for example, in entry to medical schools from white males. And is that something we need to be mindful of? Well, obviously, we've had many years of domination of the medical profession by white males. But if the current trends that we're now seeing continue, then actually we'll, in a few years' time, we'll completely flip that on its head, which is not what we want to achieve either. So it's around how do we end up with the optimal output. Next question that came from the South was about workforce planning. And it's a question really, I won't read the whole question out because it's quite long. It's a very good question actually, but it's quite a long one. The question is really about if all we do is simply aggregate what NHS employers are asking for in terms of the workforce of the future, aren't we at risk of perpetuating the past into the future? Because what we're actually trying to do is to transform the workforce and end up with a different skill mix, new professions, new roles. And I think this question is absolutely spot on, and this is where HEE's role comes in. To be honest, if workforce planning was simply about adding up what every trust put in, then you wouldn't need the HEE workforce planning team. It's about using that as one source of information and then making educated and informed decisions on the basis of that information plus information from a variety of other sources. And those sources would obviously include the teams working within HEE, particularly within DEC. They would include the exec team of HEE, but they would also include Royal Colleges, they'd include trade unions, they'd include non-NHS employers, they'd include NHS employers as a body, a very wide range of stakeholder groups. Our own advisory groups, our own HEAGs would be asked for their views and perspectives and thoughts, so that hopefully we take the data, the information that we get from providers, but we then subject it to a fair degree of testing to make sure that we actually believe that it is going to help produce the workforce that we need for the future and not just perpetuate the current workforce that we have at the moment. Question from Health Education Thames Valley. How do we measure the success of the webinar? Well, basically on feedback. So if you think it's a waste of time and you don't like it, or you don't like being forced to sit there and listen to me waffle on for 30 minutes or so, I don't know that unless you tell me. So what our comms team have been doing since the first two webinars is receiving feedback from comms people in local areas and embedded in different teams to actually say what works, what doesn't work. But we need this feedback to keep coming in. So good and bad, because if all we get is bad feedback, then we will change it on the basis of that bad feedback, whereas if people actually think some aspects are good, then give us the good feedback. I am mindful, as I said before, that it still feels very much like a one-way process, so I am giving information, or Simon is giving information, and I do ultimately, just to give warning to our IT friends and colleagues, I do ultimately want to get to the position where the technology works, that everybody can watch it at their desk and can actually send questions in real time from their desk back to me. Although some other people have said, you know what, it's quite nice getting the whole team together in a meeting room because it gives us a chance to have a conversation either before or after. So give me your feedback. Feed it through the comms people, email me directly, let's have your feedback, trip up any directors who may be walking past and tell them what you think, because we are genuinely very receptive to views and thoughts and perspectives. Midlands and East, what are the key themes of Health Education England's discussion with Secretary of State? I think, to be honest, I've covered most of them. The area that I probably haven't talked about much has been the area that Lord David Pryor is leading on, which is around how do we make sure that the financial challenge as set out in the 5-year forward view is actually delivered. So David is taking responsibility for efficiency across the NHS, and he is of course wanting to have regular conversations with all the arm's length bodies to make sure that they're doing their bit. So, you know, Public Health England in terms of what are they doing, particularly on the sugar and alcohol agenda, and they've been set a target of £500,000 in terms of their potential, sorry, £500 million in terms of their potential saving towards the 5-year forward view as a result of alcohol reduction, and that's around in the short term the acute effects of alcohol, you know, the impact it has on accident emergency departments on Friday nights, Saturday nights, and trauma and all the rest of it, but also the more chronic, more long-term effect of alcohol and the bill that lands the NHS with, particularly in terms of liver problems, but also mental health and other problems as well. And then the burden associated with sugar, processed foods, diabetes in particular. So he would be looking at what are Public Health England doing to deliver in those areas and satisfying himself about the adequacy or otherwise of their plans. And he will be doing just the same with us, making sure that any potential savings from the work we're doing around workforce transformation is counted against the 22 billion for the overall delivery of the 5-year forward view. So that's probably the one area I didn't mention earlier, but I did say at the introduction to the question session, I would like to perhaps in the next webinar spend a chunk of time on 5-year forward view and where we are with that. Question from Midlands and East about staff morale. And yes, I agree with the question that low morale can impact on organisation capacity and capability. It's interesting that one of the best ways to reduce morale is to talk about morale being bad, because that immediately drives down morale. I may be wrong, but I don't believe that morale is bad across this organisation as a whole at the moment. I believe in some parts of the NHS morale is not good, but we can either be victims or we can actually come forward and say, okay, what are we going to do to change the environment in which we operate in? How are we going to make it the best environment we possibly can? How are we going to engage with colleagues and friends in the workplace? How are we going to participate in some activities outside of the workplace, but as a team of people? Because those are some of the best ways of driving up team spirit, driving up and improving morale. I am still keen to resurrect something that was talked about a while ago, and if we've got any volunteers, then if they want to let perhaps Nikki Latham know, that'd be much appreciated. We a couple of years ago, 18 months ago, we did talk about setting up some sort of inter-ALB challenge, which could be sporty, or it could be quizzes, or it could be a combination of them. And I know there's been quite a positive response from some of the ALBs to doing that. So if anyone is interested, if we have any hidden sporting talents buried in our midst, then let Nikki know, and we'll see if we can get some of that off the ground. So I think I've probably just got time for one question to conclude with, and that is around where we are with some of the enabling functions, because there's a question around what's happening with filling some of the vacant posts that still exist within the enabling functions. These are all underway at the moment. Part of it has just been a function of timing in terms of where we've got to, but it is still our intention to fill the enabling posts. It is still our intention to continue to work on harmonisation across HEE. So we had a meeting with all the LETB chairs yesterday. One of the agenda items there was how do we continue to work on standardisation of what we do whilst recognising and respecting localisation. So what that means is, you know, how do we make sure that we're all following the same policies and processes, that the decision you're going to get in Newcastle is the same as the decision you're going to get in Manchester or London, but that doesn't mean that the agenda has to be exactly the same. If something is a priority in Newcastle that isn't a priority in Manchester and London, then we should actually be able to get on and deliver it. That's the purpose of having LETBs. So the conversation yesterday was very much around how do we standardise minute meetings from LETB boards, how do we make sure that we're reporting information in a consistent way, how do we have a common performance report that we can use across the country to actually allow us to standardise it. And this is all part of, if I take the HR team, for example, I think we've already seen real benefit in HEE by bringing the HR professionals across HEE together into a much more cohesive team rather than having them work exclusively for local teams. And we are going to continue to push and drive that agenda forward. The same applies to governance people, the same applies to comms people, because it's all part of our objective to create a single organisation that is responsive nationally and responsive locally. So I'm going to bring this webinar to a close there. Thanks very much indeed once again for listening. As I said earlier, if you do have any comments, please let us know, good or bad, and we will try and modify, amend, change as necessary depending on the comments that we receive. I'm mindful that a lot of people are going to be heading off for their summer holidays over the next few weeks, so get a good break, have a great summer. We know that we're going to head back into a very busy autumn. We've got the spending review coming up in the autumn, which will be published at the back end of November. That is going to be critically important for HEE and the work plan that we can take forward. We don't have a final date for its publication yet, but it will be back end of November, and we are anticipating that the spending review will not just give us our allocation for next year, it will give us allocations for potentially the next 3 or 4 years, which allows us to plan from a footprint of knowing what's going to happen rather than starting to get worried every year about whether or not we've got the level of resource we need the following year to take things forward. We're also anticipating a new mandate, and the work on that new mandate will be starting as soon as we get back after the summer holidays. I don't think it will be tearing up things that are in our current mandate, but I do think we'll see some modification. I think we'll see some shaping. I think we'll see some grouping of things under headings that you will perhaps recognise from the 5-year forward view. But conversations with ministers are very much only just starting around that now, but that's going to be a distinct piece of work. I'm keen that we take a look at Framework 15, our 15-year forward strategy. We said we'd review that annually, make sure that that is still fit for purpose. I think there's some areas that we've already identified that we want to tweak within that. Personally, I think the whole genomics agenda is moving faster than we anticipated, even a year ago when we wrote Framework 15. And I think there's a whole host of impact of technology in particular on delivery of care that we need to capture to a much greater extent. So again, a key piece of work around that will commence. We've also got a very significant piece of work around our workforce plan that again we'll be seeking to have finished and through our board by December. Our workforce plan has grown and grown and grown in strategic importance. Jeremy Hunt is very aware of it and by his own admission, spent quite a few hours reading the workforce plan in the run-up to the last election. So he knows what it says, he knows what's in there, he understands the concepts behind it, and that's therefore a key document for us. Equally, we know that the National Audit Office are doing a value for money audit on workforce planning in the NHS. We'll be getting the recommendations from that towards the end of the calendar year. And I think they'll be really helpful to us in terms of how we shape and change our workforce planning moving forward. So we are in for, and that's just some examples, by the way, apologies to those people whose work area I've missed there, but those are just some examples of what is going to be a phenomenally busy autumn for us. So have a good summer, have a good break, enjoy yourselves wherever you are, stay safe. A message from Public Health England, use plenty of sun cream, perhaps not terribly necessary if you're staying in this country, although that just depends on what the weather does. But stay safe, have a great holiday, have a great rest, and I really look forward to seeing you all in September when we get back and are ready to hit the ground running. Thanks very much, everybody.